Okay, so today's book review is on a book called Open and Relational Theology, An Introduction to Life-Changing Ideas, and it's by a theologian named Thomas J. Oord. I was interested in reading this book because the previous one that I'd read by Philip Goff really good, and along these lines of a newer idea of God, which is, a God that is not omnipotent, omniscient, and so forth. And so I've just been wanting to just learn a little bit more about this whole process idea of theology. And I know that Thomas J. Oord is kind of in that realm. And so I wanted to get more of a theological, formalized sense of how this works. So unfortunately, this book, Open and Relational Theology, wasn't quite what I was hoping for. It wasn't really as formalized in discussing sort of the process theology. Really what it was is, like the subtitle says, it is an introduction to why this newer idea of God is helpful and appealing to a lot of people. And he talks, pretty much the whole book is him talking a lot more on the practical level of why people are attracted to this idea of a God that isn't all-powerful and all-knowing, and really all of the reasons why it's actually better to think of God in this way. I would probably give this book maybe a 7 out of 10, just because like I said, I was hoping for a little bit more of a philosophical foundation, more of a formalized theological discussion of how this could work and why this would make sense, a little bit closer to something like Philip Goff had done. However, it was, again, it was a lot more practical. Now, it still is up there in terms of how I would rate it, because I think it's extremely helpful. I think there's a lot of truth in pretty much everything that he's saying. And I think that it would resonate with a lot of people. So basically what he's doing here is he's describing what it really means to believe in a God that is open and relational, and how that contrasts with understanding, the typical omni-God that is a little bit more traditional for our culture. And so this introduction is a way of sort of trying to draw people into the idea, to get them to feel like this has merit for a variety of reasons. And again, primarily, the reason being, this omni-God doesn't really make sense to a lot of us on an emotional or practical level, and that matters. I think what he tries to push against is sort of this apologetic idea that has been a really prevalent part of our modern Western culture, that we can't think in terms of our feelings or emotions in terms of what is true. And I think that he at least helps the reader to feel a little bit more validated in thinking that this, the way that the way that we respond to a God of this nature actually matters, the way that makes us feel, and kind of the sense that we get that things just don't seem right for certain reasons. He kind of helps to describe why that is actually a valid way of thinking about the nature of God. So yes, obviously that's not a rigorous, formalized discussion of the whole idea of what type of God to believe in, but the basics of it is open. So an open idea of God means that there is no future to be known yet. We are a part of the process of what is going to happen, and we do actually have free will. This is a big part of the text. And the relational part is that the foundational, most meaningful and primary aspect of this God is that this God is relational, not that this God is all-powerful. That's a major difference. And when he was describing in this text, when you think of it this way, there are just so many more things that make sense. So my personal response to this is, it almost feels like this is one of those too good to be true type things. And a lot of people, I think, respond in this way. We can't necessarily have it our way, but that's part of what he's trying to get at. Is there's sort of this deep moral sense that we get that this omni-God doesn't really make sense, and it just doesn't seem right. And so he's pointing to this. And this is, again, just an introduction to how we can understand it. Now, I have read previously his, I think, more recent book called The Death of Omnipotence and the Birth of Amipotence. And this is a little bit more of a formalized discussion of the theological understanding of this type of God. And so I would suggest that for anybody that really wants more of a rigorous discussion of how it could be that this sort of God exists. That, and also Philip Goff's discussion that I have discussed in another video. But overall, this is a good introduction to trying to understand how we can think about God differently. We don't have to cling to these traditional ways of thinking about the divine that have, been passed down for such a long time in one particular culture, right? There are a variety of ways that people have thought about God around the world, and even in, let's say, Christian and Jewish culture over history, there are other ideas that have existed in terms of what it means to have a relationship with God, or what God is. And so he's kind of bringing that back around. So this idea of it being an introduction to life-changing ideas is actually pretty fair. I think that's a pretty fair way of describing it. So yeah, great book. I think especially for somebody who's not familiar with the idea of what open and relational theology would mean, for anybody that is interested in trying to understand God outside of the whole omni-God framework, it's great. So Thomas J. Oord, awesome. Go for it.